They're called potholes, marshes, and swamps.
They can be found on every continent except Antarctica.
They're called waterlogged forests, peatlands, bogs.
Transition zones where water meets the land.
They're called fens, sloughs, and river deltas.
Covering just 6% of the Earth's land surface, wetlands store 10 to 20% of the Earth's carbon.
They're called mires and muskegs.
They are some of the most biologically productive and diverse communities on the planet.
They are wetlands, mysterious and misunderstood, but vital to life on Earth. Wetlands have captured our creative imaginations from Shakespeare to Emily Dickinson and Henry Thoreau. In popular culture, like The Creature from the Black Lagoon, Swamp Thing, Star Wars, and Harry Potter. As long as humans have walked the planet, wetlands have been a part of our lives. Some turned to these saturated lands for food, fuel, and other products, while others saw them as something fearful, mysterious, and undesirable. An estimated 60% of wetlands worldwide have been destroyed or impaired, mostly due to drainage for agriculture, but also through dams, levees, urban development, pollution, peat extraction, groundwater pumping, and logging. In Iowa, the majority of the wetlands were found on the Des Moines Lobe.
The central part of Iowa was the Des Moines Lobe. You could not walk 200 yards in any direction without walking into a wetland.
As the state was settled, wetlands were seen as a barrier to development. Drainage of wetlands began in the 1870s. By the 1970s, less than 1% of Iowa's original wetland acres remained, reduced from about 3.5 million acres to about 30,000 acres.
Those wetlands were drained for agriculture, and so today we have water quality problems related to agriculture.
There are a lot of wildlife species or animals that disappeared from Iowa, about 100, 150 years ago when we were first settling the state of Iowa, and it was basically a free-for-all with no laws or regulations to protect the animals that were here.
Until the 1980s, no one understood fully the value of wetlands to water quality, wildlife habitat, recreation, and beauty. It was the loss of wildlife, especially waterfowl, that supplied the first impetus for wetland restoration in Iowa.
There are over 900 types of animals living in the United States that are dependent on wetlands for at least part of their life history, or at least part of the stages of their maturity and being youngsters. And so they're incredibly important to wildlife. They're also incredibly important to us as places to explore. Not only do they help clean water, but they slow down sediment.
Wetlands offer a potential solution to some of those water quality problems because they're effective filters for a lot of the pollutants that are exported from row crop agriculture.
In the last decade, some Iowa farmland owners have been willing to take acres out of crop production and establish wetlands on their property through programs such as the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program.
Well, actually, our district conservationist pointed out to us that this would be an ideal site for a wetland because it's at the conjunction of two forks of the upper Badger Creek, and it would be able to treat a lot of water coming off of farmland before it goes down into Badger Creek Lake. Well, it just seemed like the right thing to do. Badger Creek Lake is on the impaired waterway list, and we're part of the watershed, and we wanted to do our part to get the lake off the list. So if this is one way of us being able to help out, well, that's great.
So my job is to work with farmers and landowners in the watershed to, work on establishing conservation practices, kind of like this wetland, so that as we all work together, the water quality in the lake has a chance of getting better.
Well, when it comes to having wetlands on the landscape, Iowa has already lost somewhere between 90 and 99% of its wetlands. In my view, if it's a recreated wetland, if it's a restore wetland, if it's a constructed wetland, that's still a positive move.
It really didn't take that much land out of production compared to the benefits we think we're giving to the watershed.
Like the world's largest cities, wetlands are bursting with activity, most of it under the surface, undetectable to the human eye.
And you can see it if you just look at this wetland. A lot of vegetation, a lot of waterfowl, real highly productive systems, a lot of biological activity, and especially the microbial activity in those wetlands processes and filters pollutants that might go through it.
Water is cleaned when drainage from corn and soybean acres is captured and routed into a strategically located wetland.
This wetland was designed to intercept water coming from tile outlets, and so all the water coming into here is drained off of about 700 acres up in the upper watershed. And when the tiles come into the wetlands, it gives that water time to sit around, and when the water has time to just be retained and just kind of wait, that's when the microbes have a chance to denitrify it. So the microbes convert the nitrates that have come through the tile lines into nitrogen gas.
Microbes consume nitrate the way humans consume oxygen when we breathe and respire. But this happens under anaerobic conditions, a process called denitrification.
To increase denitrification rates, you want to have a saturated wet soil that'll go anaerobic, and you want to supply that system with nitrate. So if we put wetlands in these landscape positions, we're supplying them with lots of nitrate from those 2,000 acres of corn and soybeans. And the wetlands are ponded, wet, the sediments are anaerobic. Those are ideal conditions for denitrification. The nitrogen is not primarily taken up by the plants, in other words. It's actually burned away, respired away by those microbes in the sediment.
The microbes convert nitrate to N2, an inert gas that makes up 80% of the atmosphere.
The plants help to provide surfaces on which those microbes might live, and they also provide organic carbon to help those microbes keep using nitrate.
I feel really lucky to have a crepe wetland in my watershed because it's such a neat practice.
Dr. Crumpton and his Iowa State University team are tasked with understanding the water quality impacts of these constructed wetlands.
What we want to know is how much pollutants are the wetlands removing. And so we have to measure how much comes in and how much goes out. And the pollutants that we're interested in are primarily nutrients, so nitrogen and phosphorus. So we need to measure those coming into the wetland and going out. So the difference between what comes in and goes out is what the wetland was removed. That requires that you, because the rates at which those things move in and out can change dramatically, especially after it rains. You get dramatic, rapid increases in how much is coming into the wetland. So we have to sample these things, very intensively.
Wetland construction and restoration are one of the most efficient means of reducing nitrate load from Iowa's rivers and streams. The Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, released in 2012, calls for a 45% reduction in nitrogen loading into Iowa's waters.
If we could convert 1 to 2% of the landscape into the wetland pool, right? So if we have pool area, the ponded area of the wetlands, that are equal to 1 to 2% of the watershed areas, that would get us close to a 30 to 40% reduction on a fairly sustained basis. That may sound like a lot of acres, but compared to every other alternative practice, it turns out to be relatively inexpensive, even though we do have to put a lot of land into this. This is a large footprint. There's a lot of land here. But this was not really prime corn ground, as you can judge by standing here. So the sites where these are located tend to be frequently more marginal sites, because they're the sites where the water naturally accumulates and you'd have these wet spots. And so when you can capture those spots, it's a pretty efficient strategy in terms of cost.
If we are to achieve a 35 to 45% nitrate load reduction in Iowa, we will need at least 50,000 wetlands as well as other land management practices. However, it doesn't take long for a restored or constructed wetland to add value to the land.
The effect on the hydrology is immediate. So, they'll pond water and hold it back a little bit during small rain events. They'll slow it down a little bit. As soon as you have the wetland constructed, they'll do that. In terms of microbes processing denitrification capacity, they reach most of their denitrification capacity within the first year or two. So it's very rapid.
So there are a lot of what we call pond weeds or potamogetans. That's the genus name that you'll find in the water, but you won't actually find it up above the water. Now some also are up above the water, and we call those emergent. And I think of a really high quality emergent plant being something like arrowweed or bulrush.
They'll seed them with the mix of vegetation they want to have in the pool, try to get that started more quickly. But within 5 to 10 years, if they're managed properly, we should have most of the functions that we're looking for should be well established.
Because you have that food, you're more likely to have the birds coming and stopping by. You would have birds nesting. In this particular wetland, we have some structures out there for birds to nest in, but there's also plenty of suitable habitat for the birds to nest in. You'll also get mammals coming, because where you have the birds, where you have the amphibians, where you have the reptiles, you have this food source for critters like mink and weasels and even otter that might come and feed on the frogs, feed on the reptiles, feed on those water insects that are out there. So by the time a wetland is 7 or 8 years old, I would expect to see a lot of the same players that I would see at a natural wetland that had been here all along.
Along with water quality benefits, wetlands supply the biodiversity necessary to sustain life on this planet.
This place has become a magnet for natural life, I want to call it, because it's fun to come down here in the evening and watch the barn swallows come out for water and to swoop and catch mosquitoes. There's always deer down here in the early morning and late evenings getting water. And then during the migration times of the year, I've seen this thing covered with snow geese and other types of geese, and then we've also had cranes and other birds like that come through. So it's just, and then also I've seen an increase in the quail population, and actually I've heard pheasants come back. I haven't actually seen them yet, but I've heard them.
Most people love to see great blue herons. They love to see birds of prey. And what do they eat? They eat frogs, they eat water snakes, they eat tadpoles. So amphibians and reptiles are actually the food base for a lot of the other critters that people are really fond of. The other thing that I talk to people about is bugs. Bugs are great. They are really where biodiversity is at, right? But on the same token, you don't necessarily want to get bitten by mosquitoes all evening long when you're outside. And frogs are great consumers of mosquitoes. So I think of it as serving two different purposes, and they make beautiful music. So that's also wonderful, right? If you've ever heard toads call in the spring, that long trill just sends my heart a quiver.
The biggest threat to animals is pollutants and loss of habitat.
Amphibians are sensitive to chemicals both on dry land and chemicals in the waters in which they breed and in which the youngsters develop into adults. So pollutants are a real problem, or pesticides, fungicides, you name it. The amphibians have highly permeable skin, so they take that right up into their bodies.
Because there are so few wetlands in Iowa, one big challenge is the large distance between these habitats. How do animals get from one patch of good habitat or wetland to another?
And if you look in any direction in the state of Iowa, go 1 mile and you're going to run into a road, almost without a doubt. You need a corridor of habitat where you don't have a road, and instead you have good cover, because amphibians need cover on the ground so they don't dry out. They need to stay moist and can make their way, can avoid predators until they get to the other wetland. So this is a species that's native to Iowa. This is the Blanding's turtle, and I find it by far one of the most beautiful turtles. This animal spends a lot of time on dry land, traversing the landscape, going from one wetland to another wetland. It's listed in this state as threatened. Many people are concerned about their populations, but what I find fascinating about it is that this animal, the female, takes 17 to 20 years before she'll ever lay any eggs. And if you know about turtles, when you're an egg or a hatchling turtle, your chances of survival are very, very low. But once you get to be an adult, generally you don't have any enemies to worry about, with the exception of car tires. So I just think of this as an iconic species for wetlands.
Wetlands play a critical role in the life cycle of Iowa wildlife.
So a lot of our amphibians and reptiles are going to use wetlands like this in order to hibernate over winter. They'll dig deep down in the mud. You or I could never do that, but they can do that. They don't need that much oxygen throughout that whole 5-month period. And then they will once again emerge in the spring when the ground thaws and we get those great rains that refill these wetlands.
Wetlands are incredibly important for migratory birds.
They travel through or migrate through in the spring and again in the fall. And there are several pathways from north to south in the U.S. where birds travel. In Iowa, we actually have 2 different pathways in which birds travel. There is the Mississippi River Flyway, and there is also the Central Plains Flyway, in which we get birds coming down and stopping over in these wetlands. These are incredibly important, not only for waterfowl. We all can recognize a Canada goose or a mallard duck, but they're also very, very important for shorebirds. So what these birds do is they stop here, they bulk up with calories, and then they continue on this very long flight that they have to make twice a year in order to have the food that they need, the conditions that they need to live here. One big success story is the reintroduction, the reestablishment of trumpeter swans, the largest waterfowl species in the world. These animals have a wingspan that is up to 8 feet across, and they can weigh up to 35 pounds. So they are beautiful to look at. They're huge, and they really add a lot to the wetlands that we have here.
Wetlands are sources and transformers of a diversity of life forms.
People often ask the question, do we really need to have all this biodiversity? I'll go back to my hero, Aldo Leopold, and the first, point of intelligent tinkering is not to lose any of the pieces. I don't know if we lost Blanding's turtle, how big of an impact it would have on me as a human being and my life. However, I know that if we continue to lose wildlife, we continue to lose pieces of the puzzle. If we continue to lose plants, we continue to lose pieces of the puzzle. And eventually, you no longer have a coherent picture, a coherent system that can work anymore. Eventually, you lose too many nuts and bolts, the car is no longer going to run.
Wetlands are vital to all life. Despite incredible advances in technology, humans are unable to recreate the many services wetlands provide. Water filtration, trapping of sediment, transformation of pollutants, carbon storage, wildlife habitat, and, of course, beauty. Since the 1980s, the number of wetlands in Iowa has increased modestly. To reach 50,000 new wetlands, we would only need to transfer less than 2% of the land from agricultural production into wetlands production.
Well, the easement is for 30 years, but I think it'll last forever as stout as this has been constructed. So, as far as I'm concerned, it can be here forever.
Perhaps people will realize that some of our land can be more valuable wet than dry.
Well, as a citizen, your vote counts, and I would vote for the legislators or anyone running the office who supports conservation and conservation programs. Another thing is to become more aware of where your water comes from and how it's being treated, and just in general being aware of your watershed and that everyone lives in a watershed, and the practices going on and the things you personally can do and support for the protection of your watershed.
Without wetlands, life is greatly compromised.
I think wetlands definitely add a beauty to the state. It's funny because it's a cold, chilly, windy day out, and you come up and you see that water rippling, you see all the grass blowing around it, and even though it's not the nicest of days, it's like, oh, what a beautiful day to be at the wetland.
Henry David Thoreau wrote, "When I would recreate myself, I would seek the darkest wood, the thickest, most impenetrable swamp, and I would enter them as sacred places."